Hello and welcome to today's NEASC Virtual Global Forum, Lessons in School Leadership, What the Pandemic Has Taught Us. I'm Bill Worley, Associate Director for Accreditation and School Improvement at NEASC, and my co-host today is Allison Geary, Director of the NEASC Commission on Public Schools. We're very fortunate to have educational leaders from a variety of schools with us today and really appreciate that they've taken time to talk with us during this very busy time of year. Our panelists today includes Amy Cetner, the principal of Bourne High School in Massachusetts, Ann Gardon, the head of primary school at the Chinese International School in Hong Kong, Bob McCarthy, the principal at Central Falls High School in Rhode Island, Steve Wilkins, the head of school at the Carroll School in Massachusetts. And shout out to Steve. He's retiring at the end of this school year, a long planned retirement after 35 years as a head of school. And we have Kate Windsor, the head of school at Miss Porter's School in Connecticut. So we've asked our panelists to reflect on the last year and share which approaches to leadership they used during the pandemic that will be valuable to carry forward as school returns to in-person instruction. And now I'd like to hand things over to my co-host, Allison Geary, to get the conversation started.
Thank you so much, Bill. And thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. This is a busy time of year, and we really appreciate the opportunity to have all of you with us. So let's start with some brief introductions. We're going to have each of our panelists tell us a little bit about themselves and particularly the context of the school in which they work and what kind of learning has been happening this year, remote or hybrid, or in-person learning. So why don't we start with Bob McCarthy, and then we'll move to Steve and Ann.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Bob McCarthy. I'm the principal of Central Falls High School in Central Falls, Rhode Island. I've been a teacher and an administrator for a long time, over 25 years, teaching in urban settings, in suburban settings, and also teaching overseas in Cartagena, Colombia, and most recently Rome, Italy. Central Falls, where I've been the principal for the past 3 years, is one of the most densely populated communities in the country. 95% of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch. 85% of our students, their primary language at home is not English. So it is an immigrant community. Central Falls is also somewhat infamous for unwisely firing all of their teachers 11 years ago as part of No Child Left Behind. And that is some trauma that many of our teachers who were hired back carry with us. But despite all of that, it is the most hopeful place that I have ever been a principal, and I'm super happy to be here and happy to be part of this conversation.
Go ahead, Steve. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Wilkins. I'm the head of school at Carroll School, which is an independent school outside of Boston. Our enrollment requires that each student have a diagnosed language-based learning difficulty, such as dyslexia. We have been in person in some measure since the beginning of the school year, and as we gain confidence, acquired testing. By about January, all students who wanted to be in person were in person 4 out of 5 days a week, which brings up a point I know we'll talk about, which is the unequal access to quality education throughout the world, which has really been highlighted by the pandemic. And students with learning difficulties, such as every student at my school, has likely been more adversely affected than kids who learn typically.
All right, Ann, thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ann Gardon, head of the primary school at Chinese International School here in Hong Kong. We are a K through 12 international school of over 1,500 students. We have about 674 students in the primary school. Many of our students stay for the entire through train from reception to year 13. So we are a bit more like an independent school in that regard. We have been Hong Kong has probably been one of the places in the world that's had students off campus and out of school the longest in the world, having gone online last February when the pandemic began in Far East Asia. We this year started school online and have toggled between completely online and partially hybrid for the majority of the school year. We have come back in full, as in all students on campus for the whole school day, only in late spring, April and May. And so we're in a full day status at the moment, still with quite a few social distancing regulations in place for how we conduct classes and have our lunch. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey, and yeah, looking forward to sharing and listening to everyone else's experiences.
Wonderful, thank you. Amy and Kate.
Good morning. I'm Amy Sutner. I am the building principal at Bourne High School. We're located on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Bourne High School services students from both the mainland as well as the island. We have about 425 students in our school. District-wise, about 30%, just shy of 30% are economically disadvantaged. We have been in some form of in-person learning since the fall, beginning with hybrid, and then about 8 weeks ago, we did transition to a full in-person model. In Massachusetts, the regulations, especially with regards to being outdoors, were lifted, so we were excited to celebrate our seniors with their graduation this past weekend with a relatively normal celebration outside on our football field. I'm also a member of the NEASC Commission, and I'm just excited to be here with all of you today.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our participants. My name is Kate Windsor, and I've had the opportunity to lead in 3 distinct educational venues this year. I serve as the board chair for the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls in Henley-on-Klip in South Africa. So we are in the Southern Hemisphere in the middle of our school year. Also, you know, as Steve noted, that the disadvantages are very stark as compared to the rest of the world, with less than 1% of South Africa being vaccinated. So our girls who were in person have just been sent back home and will be remote until the current wave subsides. I also am the head of school of Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, where we have girls from across the globe and across the country. The difference there being that we've had full access to testing the full community multiple times a week. And we also were able to vaccinate all adults and students before they departed from school on campus. We have been having in-person learning for the entire year, starting in August, with some students coming in remote who were facing travel barriers. I also teach graduate and doctoral students at the University of Pennsylvania. We've been remote the entire time and don't expect to be in person again until the fall. Wonderful to be here with you all.
Awesome, thank you so much. So we're going to start out with a question about leadership. So what is the greatest leadership lesson that you have learned this year through your experience? We've heard from many leaders who have said that this has been one of the most, if not the most challenging year that they've ever had in education. So what is the leadership lesson that you have learned? Let's start with Anne, and then we'll go to Amy.
Sure thing. I think the biggest lesson this year has been to be comfortable and open with not knowing, and really seeking community input along the way, listening to your staff, your students, the parents in the community, and spending the time, although we're all under a great deal of pressure to make decisions and make things happen in a high pressure situations, taking the time to listen and discuss and really consider people's experiences in the decision-making process. Maybe previous to this, as educators and leaders, we would bring to the table a certain amount of knowledge and experience, and maybe some, subconscious, thinking that we might know best because we've been through this before. We've seen this before. We know how these things work. And this is just genuinely a situation where nobody knew how this worked. So I think being open and spending the time to hear from people, and then to be really transparent about why you make the decisions that you make, and be okay with that, because certainly you're not going to make everyone happy with your decisions. And there have just been so many decisions that people have said in the moment they weren't very happy about it, but in retrospect, they realized the importance of why things were decided that way. So we've all, I think, shifted our perspective many times over the past year and a half. So I think that would be my biggest takeaway, is that take the time to listen and really understand people's experiences in this very new context.
Great, thank you. Amy?
I think, what really stands out to me this year, and you stole my my response, but I agree with you. In addition to what Anne expressed, I feel that finding a balance between providing grace and understanding given the new situations, but also at the same time maintaining high expectations for ourselves and our students in an effort to also maintain a sense of normalcy, was really important for our district and for the high school. Not putting things on the back burner due to, extenuating circumstances or the unknown, but moving forward, again, with a level of empathy and understanding, but at the same time, staying the course. It was clear that our teachers really needed that semblance of normalcy, as well as our students. So, for example, we were slighted to add a benchmark assessment program district-wide this year, and we decided to move forward with that. I mean, it was difficult, but we decided that it was something that was important for our students and for us as teachers in order to implement supports necessary, more so now than ever. So we move forward with those plans, regardless of the difficulties and the barriers. And I'm happy to say that our teachers jumped on board, as did our students, and that worked to our advantage. So again, just maintaining some balance, and I'm not saying there was perfect balance by any means, but just always maintaining that balance between, as I mentioned earlier, grace, but also maintaining high expectations for our students and staff.
Thank you. Steve, and then Bob, and then we'll hear from Kate.
I think Anne and Amy nailed it. Just this sense of humility that we have to have as leaders. If an investigative reporter held me accountable to my words from last spring, or from September, or from December, it's amazing how many times I've changed my mind and been wrong. And so Anne and Amy's comments are right on target. It's all about being flexible and trying to do the right thing and be transparent and communicate. The only thing I would add to what they said is never before in my career have I seen the relationship between teacher well-being and student well-being being absolutely integrally tied together. And to be able to hold that balance and then say to our constituents, our parents and guardians in the community, we're focused on the well-being of kids and teachers.
Just to pick up on what Steve said, I think, and I'm not sure if this was a leadership lesson or a leadership reminder of the resiliency of our students, of our teachers, and of our community. That was something that was a consistent reminder, and paying attention to that. One of the things that we did this year, I can put the link in the chat if people are interested, is we developed a teacher charter this year that we checked back on. We checked back with teachers. They developed kind of personal goals they had, expectations in terms of professionals, and expectations in terms of what they felt they wanted to measure for their relationships with students. And we checked back on that and looked at that information to try to keep that in the forefront, because I think we make a lot of assumptions, especially about teacher resiliency. And connected to that in terms of the lesson, I just think that that emphasis on, excuse me, emphasis on personalization and creating systems that reinforce that need to really know what's going on in our families' lives and our teachers' lives to a point where we can best support that that as it relates to schools.
I would say that one thing that was particularly notable about the pandemic was that it really shone the light on the strengths and weaknesses of our schools very brightly. And I think in some ways we have a lot of assumptions as school leaders about what we can't do, or the pace of change, or maybe why we're going to delay resolving some of the problems. And the pandemic forced people to actually address those issues head on. And for the most part, I would say school leaders who chose to accelerate changes that they knew were best, to amplify and use what does work well in their schools, to create solutions that were both successful during the pandemic. And I hope, as I say to my school community, that we won't be putting this behind us, but rather beneath us. That we will use these successes, and there have been many for our schools during the pandemic, to set the foundation for further change and success for our schools going forward. So I see it, as exhausted as I am right now, I see it as a remarkable moment for our schools, and feel very proud and hopeful for the future.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all. And I think in some ways you've sort of alluded to this next question, but we think about the pandemic. I mean, it definitely disrupted how schools work, and it brought about, great change in a very short period of time. Disruption can be very good. So what changes should we keep, and what's best left behind? What are we bringing with us as we move forward out of this interesting time? Steve, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Anne.
I want to talk about invisibility. Last spring, when we were shocked by the emergency of having to shut our schools down and trying to cobble together some sort of a remote program if the schools were well resourced enough to do that, a lot of teachers talked about kids becoming invisible. They had connectivity problems, probably legitimately in many cases. Kids who didn't want to be on the screen and just sort of took themselves out of the classroom. Kids who never participated, never got their work done. And from the perspective of the school I work in, where we have kids who have tried to hide from humiliation because they're dyslexic, it was absolutely no shock that invisibility is a real challenge. In designing education for this school year, I think schools that could try to figure out ways to help kids not be invisible. A really great exercise, I think, for a school to do. And one of the lessons is work in as small groups as you can arrange so the kids don't become invisible. But to ask, in whatever kind of a cohort you're able to pull off, ask teachers and support people, which students are you happy about? Do you think they're doing a really good job? And alternatively, which students are you really worried about? And create those lists, and then look at which students are not on any of those lists. And those are the kids who go invisible. And for the pandemic, it just pointed out that there have always been kids who try to be invisible. So I think, as Kate said, what do we learn from this? What are the important lessons? Try to organize ourselves in ways to make sure kids don't go under the radar, out of the Zoom, whether you're in person or not. They've always been there way back before the pandemic when we were in person. So working in small groups, every kid needs an adult champion every day in school. Try to figure out how to do that. Advisors that see kids at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day. Bob earlier was talking about No Child Left Behind. We have something called NCLU, No Child Left Unorganized. Make sure that every single kid is visible, regardless of who they are. That to me is the number one takeaway from the pandemic, and thing that we need to do in schools to try to improve the very essence of what schools are supposed to do.
Thank you. Anne?
Wow, well said. Thanks, Steve. I think two things come to mind from the disruption that are definite takeaways, and that relating to what Steve was saying, the acknowledgement that systemic assessment of student and staff well-being needs to be embedded into school practice, and not something that comes and goes at different junctures. So we've really took that on and have used different means and tools to do that, just understanding how vital it is to understand how our students and staff are doing. And part of that, the hard part was, just seeing how many individuals struggled at different times, staff and students, and knowing that we needed to continue to pay attention to this. So I believe these are things that we won't stop doing, we'll keep doing. And the other, I think, amazing outcome of the disruption has definitely been, at least in our context, this idea of using time and space differently. And, I think there was just a time just before the pandemic broke that, to make a change in the schedule was, something unthinkable. You wouldn't change the schedule without 18 or 24 months notice and all sorts of focus groups. And it was a very big deal to contemplate using time differently. And ironically, before the pandemic started, we had started working with the consultant about this very concept of using time and space differently, and really wanting to kind of break away from some of the shackles of the way we have been doing things for so many years. And it was all exciting, but it was all really just talk. And when we got down to the nuts and bolts of how can we really make this happen, we ourselves put the brakes on it, saying, okay, we really have to take it slow. And what are the steps we need to take so that, people don't get overwhelmed or scared by these changes. And lo and behold, then we were just thrust into this scenario where our use of time and space changed dramatically many times over 18 months span. And just the comfort level of that in the whole community has changed completely. People are just so much more comfortable with, oh, okay, new schedule, or kids will be here and kids will be there. They'll be grouped differently. This is how we're going to do it. I think it's just really primed us to be a lot more creative and flexible in how we envision the future of education in our context. So I'm really grateful for it, actually. It's a hard one, but a great development has come out of the disruption for us in that regard.
Great, thank you. Bob, do you want to go next and tell us about your charter that you posted in the chat?
Just posted that just in reference to previous comment in terms of, sort of gauging the social emotional levels of our teacher and trying to be explicit about, and asking teachers as they were entering the pandemic in September. This was one of the first things we did when we came back after reflecting on, being remote from March on. And just thinking about what are those measurements of wellness that would be important to me as a teacher, and then coming back and checking on it quarterly with teachers, both in terms of basically simple Google form, and then sharing those results and thinking about what are the ways that we can make these types of things more of a reality. So I think that's something that will continue. It's something that we should keep. Again, paying attention to the, as several of the panelists have said about how our teachers are doing. Just to echo something that I think Kate talked about, I think that the metaphor I always use about the pandemic is that it was like an earthquake. And if we're a house, the systems we have in place that are strong tend to get magnified, and the systems that aren't as strong really get exposed. And so I think that a lot of what we need to keep, at least in Central Falls, and what we need to continue with is contextual in terms of those specific areas. So teachers, one of the challenges that we set out for teachers was to be really explicit on a weekly basis about what our learning objectives were, how we were assessing them, how we were formatively assessing students' understanding of what those objectives were, and also kind of where their heads were, outside of the academic piece. And so I think that's a piece that just, these are things that we've all known for a long time, but the pandemic really, I think, allowed us to really focus on that in a way that was critical for our kids' ability to manage with all that they were dealing with personally and then academically. And our teachers did a fantastic job with that. And I also would just say, building on what Ann said, I just think for those of us in public schools, we need to work with union and district leadership to get out of this 8 o'clock till 2:30, 3 o'clock model, and think about flexibility for students around education. And I think that the pandemic forced us to be more creative around that. At least in our community, we had many students who needed to work to support their families. They had family obligations in terms of taking care of younger siblings, and they weren't able to be present as much as they would normally in a typical school year. And so I think that really looking creatively about how we can create individual learning plans for kids and allow teachers to have different schedules, to look at how technology plays a role for those kids where it works, where we can blend the two. Those are areas where we need to continue the momentum and continue to explore how we can support kids educationally.
Thank you. I mean, I love that, just that whole theme of flexibility, creativity, not taking 2 years to make decisions, but being able to make decisions in the best interest of kids, on the fly. And I hope that does continue. Kate, why don't you go next, and then we'll end up with Amy.
Sure. Well, I think, part of what was, I think, exciting about the changes that we made at Ms. Porter's and at OLAG was that we challenged some long-held assumptions about what mattered, and whether it was, as Ann said, time and use of time, or space, where and how you build community, what is essential for mastery of learning versus achievement. And some of the learnings that came out of that were actually will fuel some of the steps that we'll take in the future. So one of the questions has to do in the Q&A had to do with how did we address the lack of resources for many of our students in South Africa, whether it was access to internet or laptops or those sorts of things. So at OLAG, it's an all-girls boarding school. So our solution to the poverty was to bring girls out of their context and place them in the school where we could provide interventions for all of the lack of resources that they had in their regular life. When they had to learn from home, we realized that there were all sorts of ways in which we could both provide simple resource sort of workarounds, such as solar panels to provide for electricity when we have lots of brownouts and those sorts of things in South Africa, as well as understanding that we were impacting not just the girl, but her family. So in that sense, many of the interventions that we put in place allowed us to expand the impact of our mission statement, something that is usually contained within the fence and walls of our campus, and has made us think differently about how we use our resources going forward. We'll continue to have our campus in Henley and Clip, but also the success with online learning allows us to think differently about how we might extend going forward. The other thing that I think was an important takeaway is that instead of using our privilege as a school to remove girls from the community, we then began to make choices to connect the girls to resources within their community. And I think will resolve a longstanding problem that we've had when we expect our girls to go back into the system in South Africa and back into being leaders in the community. The same is true. So in both the case of Ms. Porter's and in OLAG, we did a redistribution of our resources to ensure that learning continued and expand our impact of our mission. So we will continue with an online learning experience at Ms. Porter's. One of the big assumptions that this cracked was that we did not feel from a brand perspective that we should give credit towards graduation for an online learning experience. And yet this year we did. Some girls, because of travel restrictions, were online for the entire year. They received credit for that. And we believe that it was equally, if not more valuable than the time that they've spent on campus in terms of the lives that they'll live as graduates of Ms. Porter's school. There was another question around distance and when you brought students back into the classroom. So I just want to comment about that and the physical distancing. At Ms. Porter's, our moniker, school is MPS. It stood for mask, physical distancing, and sanitizing over the past 18 months. We, as I said to the girls at graduation, we were excellent at the mask wearing, not so good at sanitizing, and disaster or sort of non-compliant when it came to physical distancing. We did test our entire community twice a week, and we only had 9 positives over the entire 12 months. And so I think the evidence would say that masking is the most important piece, and that the physical distancing is probably not a battle that you want to fight around that, and maybe not necessary. Thank you.
All right, Amy, bring us home.
No pressure. I think one of the takeaways that we're going to keep in our toolkit, if you will, is creating opportunities for that personalized blended and competency-based learning. Our teachers were afforded in Massachusetts, were afforded 10 days of professional development prior to the students returning to school. And as part of that, we had our teachers develop learning plans. We did this through a program called Modern Teacher, where the learning plans were focused on providing students opportunities to make choices about the types of learning they engage in, helps them to take ownership of the pacing and the path, as well as the responsibility for meeting those learning targets and completing the work before them. What we learned very quickly as well was implementing opportunities. We really had a theme this year on student voice. We selected that theme on purpose because we knew that in this type of environment, whether they're hybrid or remote, because we did have some students remain remote for the full year, finding ways for students to have voice in their learning. So exploring more opportunities for online tools, Pear Deck, Nearpod, Flipgrid, Padlet, those types of things that you can embed into your teaching practice. And really just a focus on equity and access. We learned very quickly that this blended learning model, provided so many rich experiences and resources for our students that we want to continue with this. So while we did explore the learning plans as a result of the shutdowns last March, we are maintaining them moving forward. And again, just looking at what experiences from this past 15 or so plus months have provided our students and our families with increased equity and access. So for example, we did all of our IEP meetings remotely, and those worked so well. It was, the attendance had increased, participation increased, again, providing the equity and access for parents to be able to participate in those meetings. Some of our parents have to arrange rides to and from school to get here, and it really broke down those barriers that traditionally existed. Some parents feel walking into a high school is intimidating, regardless of what the situation is. So providing, again, face-to-face conversations are always preferable, but providing that equity and access for them to access in different ways, whether it was, meetings with parents, meetings with students, meetings with the community. I found that some of the virtual options that were made available increased our participation. So those are some of the takeaways that I think will provide as options moving forward. Again, it opened our eyes to, and I know this was mentioned by other panelists, the pandemic and our responses to it and the ways in which we tried to navigate through it really highlighted some of our areas of strengths and more importantly, our areas of need. And that was a blessing and has definitely made a difference in some of our practices and in terms of what we're going to keep moving forward, just to make it more equitable for all of our students and families.
Yeah. And I think that things that we just would have thought, well, that won't work before, now we're like, it does work and we can do that. So, one thing about the pandemic is it gave families much greater visibility into what kids are doing in school on a day-to-day basis. And I think it increased parents' sort of admiration for teachers and what they go through, especially, parents of young children. But how could we keep this increased visibility moving forward for parents? How do we ensure that sort of partnership between parents and the school continues, even after this time when they're going to be back in school most of the time? Does anybody have a thought about that? We don't all have to answer the question, but I just thought it would be something interesting to kind of talk about.
I can chime in saying absolutely, particularly because our students were online from age 4 upwards. So quite a unique learning experience for all of our staff. And one of the things that we accelerated our work on was identifying learning targets in all units of study across the entire curriculum for all year levels, and making sure that those were framed in student-friendly language, and putting those learning targets central to all online learning and the online learning lessons that were shared with parents in advance to the lessons. And it really, really helped us center our teaching and learning around the student experience that much more. And it really became clear that by clarifying those I can statements and those learning targets, that we could more easily trim away what might be extraneous activities or assessments, because there just wasn't the same time that you would have with students in person. So we really had to think so carefully about our time, that doing that work around the learning targets really helped us, I think, to be more focused and more cohesive as a staff as well. But that, connecting to what you've just asked, Allison, I think that has really helped our parents as well, just become a lot clearer on what does my child do at school? Like what is my child learning? To have those be a commonly shared language that the students know, the teachers share with parents, is something we'll definitely take moving forward, to just be very clear and transparent about what those learning targets are, because maybe previously we would have shared perhaps so much curricular information that it's a bit of, it just gets lost, especially with busy parents whose life and focus may not be in education. So this seems that it's been a really good way for us to kind of focus our work, be cohesive as an organization, put students at the center, and helps parents really stay connected and understand what's happening from day to day and where the students are going.
Great, thank you.
And
That's
also we moved from, because so many schools, particularly high schools, have been very focused on summative assessments, particularly achievement. So when you saw things nationally go away, like the SAT and the ACT, APs were no longer able to, or the testing was not successful, people realized that mastery was more important than achievement, and spent more time thinking about project-based learning and ways other than taking a test, which they realized they couldn't proctor effectively or set up in ways that we had traditionally done. And I think it was a wonderful return to what matters in terms of outcomes for education. And many schools had a lot of success pre-K through 12 with this renewed focus on mastery versus achievement. And I do hope that schools will continue to focus that way, particularly because we know that many of our markers of achievement are exclusive to, based on identity, socioeconomic status being the number one, but also in Steve's case, students with learning disabilities or learning differences, race, there's a huge opportunity gap, and that is fueled by our focus on achievement versus mastery.
Yeah, Kate, I can't just let that sit there, because you're just absolutely on my same page. One of my favorite educational philosophers, Jeff Howard, says that the fundamental business of schools is to decide which kids can and which kids cannot learn at high levels. And Kate's point is, let's get away from that kind of thinking. That's not the job of schools. The job of schools is to try to move every child forward in a positive trajectory. And the pandemic pointed this out so profoundly that some kids were not making any progress whatsoever. Unfortunately, a lot of schools don't know which kids are making progress or not. So let's get to formative or summative assessments. And to your point, Allison, about how do we include parents, to engage in these conversations with parents about their students' progress. In much more real ways than we have ever done before.
yeah, thank you. Bob, did you have something?
No, I just couldn't agree more with Kate and Steve on this specific issue. And I think that one, in terms of the earthquake metaphor, which I'll continue to hammer at everybody, I think that we realized very quickly that our grading policies, our assessment policies were not aligned with how we needed to demonstrate student mastery. And so that is work that we're doing this summer. And so coming back to a theme that others have talked about in terms of leadership challenges is, how are we supporting the here and now, and how are we also moving forward and building on what we see as both things that we've identified before the pandemic, but things that have become even more clear during the pandemic. And just super quick in terms of parent engagement strategies, this is a big challenge in our community. And so one of the things we did do, sort of similar to NEASC, is we started hosting weekly Facebook Live sessions, bringing in not only bringing in students and teachers to talk about programs, but bringing in community resources at the same time to talk about different ways that there are resources out there that families can access support. And we would do those in in Spanish and in Creole, which are our two other languages that are predominantly spoken. So trying to think a little bit differently than your typical, PTO coffee or emails. We had text messages that went out in different languages, but really trying to think about different ways that we can access communication as communication changes so quickly in front of us.
Okay. Looking at our time, we're running out of time. There's a question in the Q&A that talks about addressing learning gaps, those that might have arisen out of a student's lack of self-discipline, or maybe they weren't quite engaged, or students who weren't able to log in, or there's many reasons why students may not have been able to learn as much this year in a typical year. So would somebody like to address that? Have you talked about that? Maybe Amy, you can start since you didn't answer the last question. Have you already talked about sort of in the fall, what kinds of assessments will you be doing for students that will help you figure out sort of where they are and what needs to be addressed?
Yes, we began that process this year with our benchmark assessment program. That's a district-wide program to provide us valuable data from which to gauge student learning this year. We are providing a summer academy this summer for a select group of students, but in the fall we've we are a district that has committed to MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. We're in about year 4 of that process. So we've already started to embed that in our practices. However, we are also providing a schedule that supports those direct services for all students, whether they be interventions or extensions. We are also looking to implement, as a result, in kind of piggybacking on the last conversation, we are implementing the College Board's pre-AP program for all of our freshman courses. We're excited about that. It provides, grade level work for our grade level expectations for our students, which we know they need, as well as builds in the scaffolds and supports, to get all students to achieve mastery in those grade level expectations and standards. So we're excited about that. So quite a few things on the docket as we move into the new school year over the summer and the new school year that we're really excited about. Again, just maintaining those high expectations for our students and really communicating to them that we know they can do it, and we'll be with them every step of the way to help them get there. And I think that messaging is extremely important, as well as those relationships, building those strong relationships with students and really communicating and messaging that we believe in them. So we're excited about what's on tap for next year.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Maybe 1 or 2 more responses on that.
I would go back to the point around highlighting both our strengths and weaknesses, and be careful not to blame students for gaps that may be there, but maybe use it as a way to think about what is it about how adults over the past year organized themselves, adults communicated, adults taught students that led to these gaps, and think about the types of interventions and remedies that we may use based on that knowledge to more fully engage those students with gaps going forward. And so I would encourage people to assume that there are gaps, because guess what? There were gaps before the pandemic, and not to think that just because we're now in person versus online or remote, that those gaps have gone away. And really think about the particulars in terms of weaknesses that may be were particularly evident in teaching and learning during the pandemic, and double down on those, because they won't go away. They weren't created by the pandemic, and frankly, they are the fault, if you want to assign fault. But I'm going to focus more on the responsibility of the adults to remedy.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to the social and emotional support that we talked about, that students are also going to need coming back to school, because there are those who have been gone, maybe they haven't been back yet, and they're going to need that support as well. Any other thoughts on that question?
Just want to say, one of the things we've tried to restructure some positions, and I would like to think this would have happened whether or not we had the pandemic or not, but we have a position which kind of focuses more on credit recovery, and we're shifting the focus of that position to really focus on the 9th and 10th grade. Some of you might have read the Make or Break Year, which identifies, I think for those of us in high school know how important that 9th grade year is, but really devoting a lot of resources to our 9th and 10th graders, not only social emotionally as they make that transition, but also to the academic, to the learning gaps that I think have been exacerbated by the pandemic. But as Kate said, for many students were there to begin with. We're also adding a period which is solely devoted towards students being able to do skill building in identified areas where they need additional support. And so teachers are creatively thinking about how they're going to support that and are identifying where kids need that support. So we're really trying to individualize or personalize as much as possible where those supports need to be and how we can best address them.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and we wanted to just ask you all sort of a personal question, which was what was your shiniest silver lining during the pandemic? What was it that was a positive for you this year? So why don't we start with Steve, especially because this is your last year in education, and then we'll go to Anne and Amy.
I don't know if this is a worldwide phenomenon, that the Registry of Motor Vehicles is a particularly ornery organization. Is that true worldwide? But in Massachusetts, they just announced what they had learned from the pandemic. And that's to make the whole process of getting a driver's license and renewal and all those things more efficient, more personal, less waiting in lines, and to use technology to support the well-being of everyone. And somebody asked a question in the chat about that. Access to technology is hugely important for the future of giving personal attention to children. So that's a little prelude to the shiniest moment at our school. Because of our kids' learning profiles, they have to catch up more than a year's worth of progress in fundamental skills in a year than typical kids. So we got our full 93-page report of how our students did in catching up in reading, writing, math, and our kids did really well because to everybody's point, we changed up practically everything in the interests of kids making important, meaningful, visible progress. And so that report revealed that we did, kids made progress very similar to what they did prior to the pandemic. So if we were able to help kids make that kind of progress in these ridiculously challenging conditions, just think what we can do for kids' progress once we're past the pandemic. And to all the panelists' points, that we have changed up so many things that we should be less afraid of changing up time, space, and values in the interest of kids' progress. Shiniest moment, kids made progress.
Awesome, thank you so much. Amy.
I think the shiniest moment was actually this fall, when there were a lot of unknowns and a lot of stress and a lot of exhausted teachers and administrators. At the high school level, our teachers were willing to jump on board and give our students a truly synchronous experience, despite the amount of work that it involved. So whether you're at home, whether you're in person, it was fully synchronous for all students. So they were just extremely dedicated to making that experience seem in person for all students, regardless of where they were. So the shiniest moment was that they were so student-centered. They were so focused on moving forward and trying to provide some normalcy. So they're my shiniest stars. Our faculty and staff and support staff really knocked it out of the park. So I'm just so incredibly humbled to be able to work with such a dedicated group of educators. I know all of you have those in your buildings as well.
Thank you. Anne and Kate?
shiniest silver lining, two things similar to what Amy just said. Yeah, just remarkably humbled and inspired by all of the staff and their incredible flexibility. Just the flexible thinking about what school should be has just been astounding, and it just makes me excited to know about what we can accomplish in the future. And the other shiniest silver lining is I think our school is generally actually a very happy place, but everyone coming back together at certain junctures, we had these moments where everyone could come back or part of us could come back. And it was just a renewed sense of deep appreciation for this place called school, you know, this special place and space and time in a child's life that, you know, leaves a mark on them, their school experience. And, you know, whether part of that is remote or hybrid, there's still something to be said about being together in this place to learn and grow together, and to see and feel this elevated and yet deeper sense of appreciation of what it means to be a part of a school community. Just really kind of unlike any other feeling I've had in my career. So definitely a silver lining.
We have an all school theme every year. 3 years ago, it was paying attention on purpose, which was really about doing away with technology and looking each other in the eye. The next year was about belonging and really building an inclusive community, and the ways in which we need to think carefully about our identities and the identities of others. And who would have known that this year, the use of what we were trying to interrupt, technology, would actually be our greatest tool towards belonging and inclusion, and including what Amy said. There are many people for whom, particularly in a very privileged environment like Miss Porter's school, are not able or comfortable walking through the halls. And we were able to create that sense of welcome, that sense of belonging, without requiring the time, the money it takes to actually get to Farmington and walk through the doors of our building. So a wonderful, wonderful aha moment. And as much as we're happy to be in person and look forward to more of that, we also will not give up the ways in which we have welcomed in all members of the community and the wider world into Farmington through technology.
Great. And last word, Bob.
So yeah, silver lining was that our high school kids acted like elementary school students in terms of their excitement about being in school, and weren't not afraid to say it. And so I think that along with, and I think they also recognized how hard teacher support staff worked to support them when they weren't in school. So it's just a completely different vibe for those who are in school, except maybe for today when it's like 110 degrees in the building. And then the last thing I would say, and it's something that came up in the Q&A, is I just feel like there's going to be, like, I think that sometimes we pay lip service to student voice, but don't find authentic ways to really identify it. And this is just a great way for us to, for those of us in the secondary especially, but not just that group, to really mine the experience of students for their thinking about how the answers to all these questions that were posed today, because they'll have some very valuable responses that can help us as well.
Thank you. And just a reminder, a few weeks ago, we did a similar webinar with kids, and that's on our website. So if you want to hear what students have learned from the pandemic and sort of what they see moving forward, you can check that out. Thank you so much, all of you, for the conversation. We really appreciate your perspectives, and I will turn it back over to Bill, who will finish up.
Once again, we'd like to thank our panelists and all of the attendees for joining us today. Remember that you can continue the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag NEASC Forum, and to check our website for recordings of this session by tomorrow. For our panelists, for my co-host Allison, and everyone at NEASC, I'm Bill Worley. Thank you, and we'll see you in September.